We will pick up where we left off, Mrs. Winfield and Mr. Riley.
And just to note, Justice, that they're still under oath.
Thank you.
I should mention that we usually take the luncheon break at about 12 o'clock, but we will break at 10 past 12.
Okay,
So gear that, and then we will resume.
Okay. Yes, sorry. I just wanted to respond to Council Whitehall's opinion concerning what does immigration have to do with the Commission's work. And I would state that immigration and demographics of this island are key in many cases to what happened later. And understanding what happened around demographics is extremely important. It's like looking at World War II and just looking at the 5 years of the war without understanding the context and the history of how the Second World War came about. So we have to be able to look at this broader history, because the demographics of this island affected for years who could vote, when they could vote, and how many people could vote. And so we have to understand there was a constant effort to ensure that those demographics reflected a certain group of people on the island. So I hope that sort of provides a clearer understanding of the connection for immigration to legislation, who gets to pass the legislation, when they get to pass it. It's basically based on who's in power. And there was concerted efforts to ensure only certain people were in power. And to continue, I think I finished talking about the 1967 UK Hansard report, which people can download online if they wish to do that and see that. We then had the 68 general election, and we moved to the Wooding Commission. I'm going to hand the predominantly over to Cordell now, who will lead the rest of this presentation.
So in 1968, there were some disturbances. Started with the PLP having a youth wing meeting, and when that meeting finished, there was some sort of functions going on in town, and the youth went over to that function. But what they found was that all the whites were being permitted to go in, and blacks were not allowed to go in. And they were saying that the whites were volunteers. This is all in the Wooding report, which you can download from our website. So, long story short, that resulted in disturbances, and second day it involved riots throughout the island. And so Hugh Wooding was called in to have a commission such as this into what led to those riots. And he found, of course, racial prejudice, economic system and immigration policy favoring whites, something that we've established has happened throughout. The established interest, failures in the educational system, voting franchise, lack of employment opportunities, substandard housing, and mostly among, of course, black families. So this is something that he wrote in that time, how they found Bermuda. The roots of civil disorders lie deep in the history of Bermuda society. The society was typically white plantation in character, and the history in the years before the 40s was of accepted white supremacy, words that even today cause some people to cringe, with all the concomitant evils of segregation. So after that, there was a series of recommendations, and you'll see some of these recommendations parallel to some of the things in other reports that we've already presented. So here, you want black men and women must be seen to be truly in authoritative positions in government, commerce, the hotel industry, professions, everywhere. As you mentioned, earlier, that in some places blacks were denied because they felt, particularly in tourism, that they weren't able, whites would not come to Bermuda if blacks had to serve them. The system of relying on import duties for almost all of the company's revenues bears unfairly upon the less wealthy, and the call was put in place again for direct taxation. Now, that taxation system has not really changed. 60% of every dollar earned by the government comes either from customs duties or payroll tax. So, the report goes on to say that the government wholeheartedly endorses the Commission's opinion that what is urgently needed is a new and true understanding, a deep conviction of the essentiality of building a single community. Because up until this point, there were two communities. There were, in fact, if you will, two Bermudas. And so, in order to stop this from happening, there had to be a consensus to build one Bermuda. And it says, an underlying commitment to promoting the democratic values of equality and fraternity in a society that is free in all aspects. So that was the Wooding report. And so we mentioned the census before about the increase in the foreign-born population in the 1970. There was a 66% increase in that foreign-born population. Again, the records will show the vast majority of them white. And then you have the 77 riots, just 10 years later, as a result of the hangings of Buck Burroughs and Larry Tacklin. And again, that's available on our website for the Pitt Commission report. And I'll go into some of the recommendations of that in just a moment. In 1981, of course, you had this first general strike. Again, all this unrest in Bermuda has to deal with underlying challenges that had been written and spoken about before, but had not been dealt with. In 1994, a Bermuda College lecturer who was living here, a sociologist, Dr. Dorothy Newman, was hired to write a report comparing Bermuda to other countries, and the progress was being made. And basically what she found was that if you want to measure how the progress, you can do it by ownership of housing and all of those sorts of things. Bermuda was lower on the scale when it comes to other countries. And of course, when you dissect the information by race, you will find that there's always a wide disparity between blacks and whites. And one of her comments was that in a biracial society, the fact that we don't even collect data by race in and of itself is institutional racism. So what are some of the recommendations of the Pitt report? Again, sharing wealth, reducing immigration. So again, one of the underlying issues of Bermuda's problems is immigration. It has definite relevance. And also, in the long run, it will prove essential to regulate the transmission of inherited wealth. This is an important distinction. Most of the data that we have is on income. We do not have any data on wealth, but we know from even going back to 1834, where the wealth was, there was a huge influx of money as a result of the sale of the enslaved people. And as you saw, that there was no real taxation on that. So that money was allowed, and that wealth was allowed to build up and be passed on from generation to generation to generation. And so now it's saying, again, if you want to create two Bermudas, just let that continue to go, or you can now have some legislation that would regulate the transmission of inherited wealth. In 2007, there was a workforce equity bill. That was a bill to sort of recognize the imbalance of the past, but unlike the United States affirmative action bill, there were no quotas in it. It was basically a nudge to get people to, or organizations to recognize that their workforce was imbalanced as a result of these immigration and policies and these legal policies that were put in place over time, and that in order to change that, legislation needed to be done. Now, in 10 years earlier, 1997, I think that was, the former Commission for Unity and Racial Equality actually produced a document in terms of what organizations could do to bring about a more fairer and balanced workforce. But because there was no legal teeth behind it, it just sat on the shelf. And so here we have, in 2007, this document or this bill being proposed. But of course, initially, the international sector got behind it because this is the type of thing that they do wherever they operate. But the local businesses were opposed to it and made their voices known. And eventually, the bill was repealed, or it didn't go through. In 2009, Mincy, Professor Mincy from Columbia University was hired to do a report, and was looking at black males and their counterparts. And what he found was that there was a wide disparity based on earnings on race. 29% of the racial gap based on his study was due to race. He was using logistic regression, and he was able to have access to the census, so he had the most complete data set possible, and were able to come up with his figures. 57% of the disparity was due to industry, where people work. So, for instance, if you worked in the international sector, you would earn more. If you worked in the hospitality industry, you would earn less. But he also pointed out that where you work was based on race. Now, I'm going to, Lynn, you want to take up with the grave sites again?
Yeah, this is a photograph of the Tuckerstown Historical Society and Curb. We advocated for a period of time to have the Tuckerstown Cemetery protected, and it was made into a historic preservation area. This particular photo is of people who attended the big conversation in 2007. It was arranged for people to go and visit the site. You can see there there were only, I believe there's 11 graves within that walled part of the cemetery. You can see the sides of the graves there. They're clearly made of Bermuda stone. The lids were made of cement. And the lids were made of cement because when they started looking for the cemetery and people wanted to find out what had happened to it, it was completely overgrown. Trees were growing out of the cemetery, so they decided to replace the lids and repair what they could at the sides of those grave sites that were still visible. I discovered this by a call to Peter Parker, who was then with Tuckers Point Club, Mid-Ocean Club, and he said that he was in charge of that at that time, and there are emails within the evidence that we're giving that discusses that, a discussion we had on both the phone and by email. And he said they found these and they repaired as best they could those ones that were damaged and replaced the lids. But by and large, the sides were original. So this was a visit in 2007 to the historic site. And every year, Marsden Church and assisted and in collaboration with Tuckerstown Historical Society would hold memorials there in honor of the ancestors of people who were buried in that grave site. If we could go to the next slide. This is a photograph of the same grave site in 2012. And you brings to mind what is happening in other countries around the world to indigenous people, where their sites of memory and cemeteries are being destroyed. And this is what happened in 2012 to the Tuckerstown Free Black community. As we've been describing, Tuckerstown was a community of predominantly free blacks, and later post-enslavement, the community grew even more. And this was the remains of their site. Now, it's believed that part of the wall was built, or most of the wall was built probably in the 1940s. And we also know from Dr. Triggs, the Wilfrid Laurier University's report, radar survey report, which is part of the evidence that were presented to the Commission, shows that there are graves on the exterior side of the walls because they'd obviously deteriorated to such a point that they had been removed and deteriorated over the time. There are photographs, early photographs of the site that you can see, aerial photographs of the site where you can still see grave sites there. But I think the reason why we're bringing attention to this is because why in today's world would you consider bulldozing a cemetery? International law has all sorts of regulations and laws around this. You can read about that in the Ombudsman's report, A Grave Error, which has also been submitted to the Commission as part of our evidence, which supports what United Nations law and what international law states about cemeteries and sites of memory like this. To bulldoze this when it was a site that was already a historic protection site speaks to the disrespect and the desecration of this site. If one had found out that the military grave cemetery out at Dockyard, for instance, was bulldozed, there would be huge outcry about the fact that that military site, although younger in some cases than this site, was bulldozed. And those sites are kept meticulously, absolutely meticulously by the National Trust. Yet for some reason, a decision was made to bulldoze this site. Between 2007 and 2012, there were many articles, and quite a number of which are in this folder and have been presented to the submission, that were written about the site, about its historic importance to black people. It is one of the oldest free black cemeteries in the Northern Hemisphere. I've only so far found one that was older. So when you think of that in the context that despite all these articles in the newspaper, despite the research that was done about the cemetery, the fact that the Tuckerstown Historical Society, including myself, had met with Tuckers Point Club to talk about how to protect the gravesite, still in 2012, a decision was made to bulldoze those graves. It was put forward that the graves were not the originals and were reproductions. I validated that they were the originals by a simple phone call, so it's somewhat confusing to hear that other people thought that they were not originals, especially as that very fact had been discussed in various articles about the Tuckerstown site. Denny Richardson, who's you can see pictured in that, along with Keith Dubois and Eugene Stovall. The three of them are standing there. They're direct descendants of people buried in that gravesite. And they have all the names, a majority of a lot of the names of the people that are buried there. And yet still, that site was bulldozed. So it speaks to the disregard and disrespect and the thoughts around the fact that you can just bulldoze a cemetery. I'd also like to point out, in comparison, that in Paradise Lake, in the Great Sound, is an island which has a Boer War cemetery where the prisoners that were sent to Bermuda and lived on that island and were buried on that island when they died of the yellow fever or various other things. That Boer War cemetery was recently, comparatively recently, completely restored. Funding was sought from overseas, from the military, I think of the War Memorial in the UK. Can't recall offhand the society's name. And they replaced many of the sites, the headstones. Oh, Section 30? Thank you. No, I got it wrong. I'll let you speak to that's 30 seconds. I want to sort of basically say that that site was fully restored with brand new headstones. Yet, even if these had been replications, it still was thought to be not... sorry, that disrupted me. It was thought still okay to bulldoze those, even if they were replications. It should never have happened. But they were not replications, and that has been proved and has been documented that they were not replications. If I could make a request, I do have a an appointment at King Edward Hospital at 2. Is it possible we could proceed for another 10, 15 minutes?
If we could.
Proceed for another 10 or 15
Yes,
minutes?
okay.
Thank you. I do appreciate it. You know, these appointments at the hospital are hard to come by.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Okay, we go to the next slide. And I did also just want to finish on the Tuckerstown Cemetery. When one looks at the stakeholders that were involved in the cemetery, we are talking about the Tuckerstown Historical Society, who were very involved in trying to protect it and were the lead voices in this matter, and as direct descendants represented many people whose families are buried there. You had the Wilfrid Laurier University, Dr. Triggs' report on the radar survey. He clearly states at the end that, you know, that if the graves were not the original, it would be okay to remove them. But also in his text, in the text of his radar survey, he says that there should be research to make sure what was actually there before any attempt was made to remove them. You then have the Tuckers Point Club, who owns the property surrounding the cemetery and have always looked to the descendants and the Marsden Church and the descendants as the owners and responsible ones for the cemetery. And you have the National Museum of Bermuda, who was led by Dr. Edward Harris. Those 4 people were the main stakeholders who were involved in discussions around the cemetery. At some point between those 4 stakeholders, a decision was made that this was okay to do. I think the people of Bermuda deserve to know exactly what happened, who was responsible for the decision to bulldoze that site. We need to know the truth that occurred behind that site, and I really urge that at some point we get to the bottom of what led to the destruction of this site in such a horrific manner. And I think the descendants of the people buried there deserve to know. Okay. Thank you.
So continue on, we've sort of gone through the timeline before. So basically from 1834 to 1971, you have 38 years, 348 years of oppression. And I think that works out to be about 17 generations. And if you mark that 1971, you have basically 2 years of quote unquote freedom. So the last part, and I probably will go through this quickly, so that will be a good idea to break after this point. We have mentioned that structural racism has outcomes, and so we're just going to go through some of the current manifestations of those outcomes. Whoops, what did I do now? Okay. So I mentioned earlier about unemployment, or it affects unemployment. So you can see here over the trend where there is a widespread, throughout the years, a widespread difference between black unemployment and white unemployment. Particularly if you look in 2012, there's a very wide gap, and the same thing in 2016. This, although the data is a little bit dated from 2000, hasn't been updated for the 2016 census, but it does tell a story, because prior to 1959, you had segregation coded in law and policy, and in 2000, you have voluntary segregation. If you were a black parent, there is an 80% chance that your child will be in public school, and if you're a white parent, there's an 80% chance that your child, or near 80% chance, that your child will be in a private school. So we move from involuntary segregation to voluntary segregation. This just goes to show in terms of the degrees. Of course, blacks being more numerous have a higher number of degrees. I think the census will show that the proportion of whites who have a degree, a 4-year bachelor's degree is about 23%, and I think that you'll find for blacks around 12% or so. I'm not sure what the 2016 study shows. I think those figures are from 2000. This slide here, I want to introduce this, and I'll just spend a very little time. This is a study that was done by the OECD back in 2006. I was in the Department of Statistics until 2001, I believe. And I did the pilot for this, and I was actually hired by the Department of Statistics to write this report. The OECD wasn't interested in Bermuda's internal politics, so what we did, because the survey was a random survey, including anybody who lived here, we took out all of those who were born in Bermuda, not born in Bermuda, to produce this report. But what this report clearly shows is that there is no difference between performance in society, which is what that report was measuring. And you can go to the OECD and look at the Life Skill and Literacy Report. Will be on their site, but this is on the government site. You can get a copy of this report here. Shows no real difference in terms of problem-solving skills, in terms of numeracy, in terms of filling out documents, or in terms of general writing skills. There was no difference in terms of the population by black and white. This is an OECD sponsored study. We were told in Bermuda that if our data didn't meet the exacting standards, it would be thrown out. And we were part of 6 countries. So when one speaks to education and functionality within society, according to this study, there is no real difference. There's no difference between functionality in society based on race. Having said that, there are discrepancies in income, wide discrepancies in income. And you can see there over the years. Now, of course, again, Minstry's study pointed out, largely it depends on where you worked. But this one here, and in the interest of time, I'm just going to be very brief, but if you notice in this, this is in the administration and management sector among Bermudians. And what you'll see here, that in 1991, in the history of time, that was only yesterday, that a person who worked in administration, these are the highest paying jobs in Bermuda, that in 1991, a black person with a 4-year college degree earned less than a white person who had no formal education qualifications whatsoever. So when people speak about it, you need education, here you're showing that a black person with a 4-year college degree earns less in a management position than a white person who had no formal qualifications whatsoever. And so I often ask, what qualifications does a black person need to compete with a white person who has no formal qualifications whatsoever? That doesn't happen anymore. As you can see here from the latest data, that no longer happens, but what does happen is that there is still a difference between whites and blacks in the administrative capacity. And what we found, if you go through the census data, only when a person has a PhD is there anything that approaches parity. I think it's about 95%. Blacks will earn about 95% of what whites earn at that level. And then studies in the United States show that that's probably as close as you're going to get. There is always this gap between the two. And if you account for all other things, to control for education, experience, et cetera, there is always a discrepancy between blacks and whites. And often we talk about the outcomes. So here are some of the outcomes. You find here, this is Steps to Well Bermuda study. Blacks are 50% more likely to have high blood pressure. Blacks are more than double, or just double, like they're 100% more likely to have diabetes than whites in Bermuda. They are more likely to be obese than whites in Bermuda. Also in the criminal justice system, 98% of those incarcerated are blacks, only 2% white in 2016. The question is it because blacks are more criminal? Or how does one get introduced to the criminal justice system? Who gets let off? Who gets a pass? So there's another area where there is disparities in outcomes, vast disparities in outcomes. And so we're going to finish now with some of the recommendations that we have in the interest of time. So what we would like to see is academic research into the history of Tuckerstown, including an archaeological research into the size of cemeteries and the location of all grave sites and church sites. Funding for a Black Bermudian researcher to write a research paper book arising out of the above historical research to be created on Tuckerstown. Unfettered access to the Tuckerstown Free Black Cemetery. Protection of the Tuckerstown Free Black Cemetery included legislative protection. Once an archaeological research is complete at the cemetery in collaboration with the descendants of Tuckerstown, the graves to be rebuilt in the traditional manner and a memorial to those who are buried there but whose graves are no longer marked be erected. The driving range be moved to a location away from the cemetery. Creation of a dedicated park at the Warwick Rubber Tree Cemetery, and funding for research into the history of St. David's Island and the historic land laws. And a memorial to all those thousands of enslaved African Bermudians buried across Bermuda whose graves have been lost to sight and memory. And that concludes, members of the commission, our submission.
Sorry, thank you both. The graphs that you referred to, Mr. Riley, in the last part of your presentation, are those to be found in Exhibit 4?
They would be the PowerPoint that we would have presented this morning, so you would have that, yes.
They're not standalone, they've been presented to us.
They were, yeah, they have, yes, that's,
Oh, they're okay, very well. Thank you. And shall we say we'll resume at 2 o'clock? What time is it now?
It's 2 o'clock.
2 o'clock, so we'll resume at 2 o'clock, and then you'll take your questions at that time?
okay.
You may have to do that.
That will be me, because Ms. Whitfield had mentioned that she has an appointment.
I will see if I can change the appointment, but
Oh, you have to,
I might be able to change it. I'll call them right now. So.
okay, good. Because, the lunch is prepared and
No,
you
that's fine.
can. Thank you.